your obvious love of New York City, which I share, but how cities could be maybe built with more Catholic values in mind. And certainly, we're not unique in that we had a really tough time weathering COVID here in New York, but even after that pandemic, soon after things started to get at least somewhat back to normal, we had the immigrant crisis as well here in New York City, and kind of adding to what was already a very difficult homeless situation. Where could Catholic values at the city level and really for all municipalities and communities really come into play to hopefully create a better environment for everyone?
Thank you, Carl. Appreciate the kind words. So, the migrant crisis, to my mind, demonstrates several failures of governance and quite a glaring lack of courage, in part because government officials today are essentially incentivized not to mess things up. By that I mean that they don't really have many times like the authority to make decisions. They simply check boxes. They follow procedures, right? And in a sense, that's to prevent them from abusing their authority, right? But what it does is it disempowers them from working towards the common good. And we saw that in particular with the migrant crisis, in part because we have a 43-year-old consent decree that was only originally intended for 750 homeless men in the Bowery district, now governing the homeless shelter system with over 120,000 people in it, right? It's not suitable for today's circumstances. It is not suitable for an unprecedented acute migrant crisis that New York City had never seen. And yet, Mayor Adams did not challenge this either in court, because in order to undo the right to shelter, he would have had to go to court and either get the Coalition for the Homeless, the private party that is part of this consent decree, to amend it, to agree to changes, or to just tell the court, look, we are going to abandon our obligations under it because it is unsustainable and is unsuitable for today's circumstances. Adams didn't do any of that. He simply allowed more contracts with nonprofit operators to allow for more migrant shelters, more hotels, more of these HERCs. These are congregate shelter facilities, often that are administered through the hospital system to avoid additional oversight and scrutiny, because the hospital system is not a city agency. But the sort of long and short of it is, he simply followed the status quo and did not take the courage to challenge what was obviously unsuited for today's needs, right? And the sort of striking thing about it is that it's a political winner, right? No one really wants to see the chaos that New York has seen of migrants on, lined up outside of the Roosevelt Hotel, of trendy Aragua opening up brothels on Roosevelt Avenue in Queens and trafficking poor, helpless women, right? Nobody wants to see that, and yet he didn't have the courage to simply say, you know what, we're going to try and do something about this, even to just go up to Albany and say, look, let's pass a law to preempt this right to shelter and to put in a statute that allows for commonsensical, reasonable shelter obligations across the entire state, because the right to shelter is predicated on a state constitutional provision. So, how does Catholic identity tie into all of this? Well, of course, government has appropriated a lot of the role that would have ordinarily gone to the charitable sector, right? The Catholic Church still plays a big role in the provision of services, like hospital services, of course, but the government has crowded that space, right? And the right to shelter is a good example of the government basically stepping in and saying, okay, well, we're going to try to take care of all of this. And we see $4 to $5 billion now spent on this crisis, that is not being spent on native New Yorkers, right? So fundamentally, we are also confronting a crisis, I think, of political loyalty, right? To whom do our representatives owe their loyalties, right? First and foremost is to their native constituents, right? And of course we have to be compassionate, we have to be generous to our newcomers, we have to help them as much as possible, but there is an excessive potential there as well. And many New Yorkers are, at this point, fed up with it, and I think that's why we saw a major shift a week ago. So yeah, there's room for the church to do more of what the government is doing, but I think there's a great need for more courage and more prudence in government.
Anything to add, either of you?
Yeah, this actually brings up a great point in general that I wanted to make about particularly public service and statesmanship. You mentioned Mayor Adams, and that's just one of many examples of failure. But I think one of the problems that we have with the lack of courage, especially, comes from people who I think are initially with good intentions kind of want to bide their time. I see it a lot in the legal profession. People have been taught, especially through a lot of the good work that the Federalist Society has done, but for those of you who are familiar with it, the kind of culture that it created was, listen, we're a minority, we have to lay very low as law students and then as young lawyers, and then we can basically infiltrate the federal bench. And it did work in a lot of ways. But I think that there's a danger with that kind of mentality, because it's one thing to lay low, that can be prudent, but at a certain point, if you do the wrong thing or avoid doing the right thing over and over because, well, eventually I'll get to this position of power where I can then do so much good. But when you've cultivated the habit of being a coward or of doing nothing for 10 and 15 and 20 years, it's unlikely that you're going to rise to that position and then do good. So I talk about the bench as one example, but I think this is a huge problem in our government officials and our politicians in general, that they are so used to this, well, if I don't vote this way and do nothing in the legislature, then I won't make senior leadership, and then I won't be speaker, and then I can't really do anything great. But in the meantime, you end up building these careers of really doing nothing. So I think it's really important to see more people from the private sector or from outside, get enough of an idea of what they want to do in public service, and maybe have one hill to die on. There's one issue that I want to go into the legislature or into this position to do, and I want to try to do it, and then if I get out, that's fine, that's my plan. And in a way, honestly, when I was at the county government agency, that was kind of what I did. I had a couple of reforming ideas that I wanted to do, but I also knew it was a children and youth agency that eventually some issue or other would force me out, so it was kind of like a targeted, I'm going to go in, see what I can do and get out. I think if we had more statesmen who had that idea rather than trying to stay in power for as long as possible, we'd be a lot better off.
And remember, if lots of people in government are creative, talented, hardworking people, right? But they are incentivized to follow the checklist, to follow the procedure. Why? Because they can always fall back on that, right? Even if things don't work out well, they can just say, well, I was doing what I was supposed to do. The issue is that, well, procedures are no substitute for good judgment and good deliberation and courageous leadership, right? And they cannot adapt to today's circumstances. So I think we do need to go to a position in governance that empowers our leaders to make decisions and then to hold them accountable for them, right? If we don't like what they're doing, well, we vote them out, we get rid of them, right? But we don't hamstring them with all of these restrictions on their ability, because then they're never going to be motivated, they're never going to feel, and we're not going to get the benefit of their talent, which is a real shame.
Now we have a room full of